Nintendo's ARMS is a 2017 Nintendo Switch launch title that I saw a lot of people never really understood. At a base level, it's incredibly simple. Your goal is to use your abilities to punch and grab your opponent while avoiding their own attacks by dashing, jumping, and blocking in order to come out on top by getting a TKO. At least, that's what the presentation of the game would want you to think. Because there were so many people who were interested in either playing the game for the first time or rusty veterans wanting to return, I wanted to create this. In this video, I've teamed up with my new friend, SNG ARMS, to bring you a definitive, one-stop shop to understanding and getting good at ARMS. I'm BrettWils, and this is the Beginner's Guide to ARMS. To start off, I want to be clear that I'm not going to teach you the base mechanics of throwing a punch. The game has a tutorial for that before you start playing, and we already blew through it in the intro. Instead, we're going to first focus on the fundamentals. Before we can start getting good at ARMS, we need to understand how the game works at its core. Over the years, a lot of people have compared it to rock, paper, scissors, and I wouldn't say that that's off base. You have three main means of outplaying your opponent. Punches that can go through grabs that can pick up and chuck your opponent out of shields, and blocking that can deflect punches and help minimize damage from rushes. As you play through rounds, you build up a rush meter that allows you to do an all-out assault to rack up big damage, assuming your opponent can't shield or hit you out of it. It's a simple enough system with an equally simple selection of movement. You can walk, you can dash to evade punches, and you can jump in order to change the characteristics of some arms and get some sick aerial shots. Largely, you would think dashing would be the overall best movement option, but that's not really the case. Whenever you dash, you open yourself up to attacks, and you can attack your opponent during the dash itself, very similar to dodging in Super Smash Bros, as there's a few buffer frames immediately after dashing where you're unable to act, all while losing any kind of invulnerability frames from your initial dash position. It's really best to avoid dashing when you can, and to only use it sparingly to evade attacks from your opponent, with one exception, but we'll get to him later in the video. Jumping is a little more open, and is in general going to provide a better dodging option as you're still able to send out attacks if necessary, all while staying in the same relative position on the stage. Upon landing though, you will have a few buffer frames to deal with. Overall, you need to ensure that when it comes to movement, walking should realistically be most of your travel, with jumping and dashing being used only when you know it will get you out of trouble as opposed to into more of it. Doing this will allow you to control more of the stage and neutral game, making you a more difficult obstacle to overcome for your opponent. This is all good on a base level, but realistically, how you handle moving around the stage is going to largely depend on what character you're actually playing as, so let's go ahead and get into that. A couple of small things that I want to establish as we get into characters. Firstly, this section alone could really be its own video, so if you don't need info on every single fighter, I've divided this portion into sections so you can pick and choose who you want and then head off to the next section. I do recommend checking out all of the fighter explanations in the video though, so you know how to play against them. A lot of people don't think that the characters actually play differently and it doesn't matter, but they're wrong, dumb, and that's objectively false. So I'm going to be breaking down all of the stats for each character. Feel free to take notes. More or less, everyone has their own stats for things like movement speed and arm girth, which is essentially the size of your arm's hitbox. The one exception to this is health. Every playable fighter has the same amount of health, clocking in at 1,000 hit points. Once you whittle that down to 0, or have more health remaining than your opponent at the end of the round timer, you win that round. I feel this really helps make the goal of each match fair for each player, instead of having to overcome varying health pools and having frailer characters no one uses compared to gigantic beefy tanks. Everyone can get their own fair shake in the Grand Prix. First up on the chopping block is Springman. I would say that Springman is really your kind of everyman fighter. His stats are all set at the base, default levels for understanding the game, and is largely a character that I recommend keeping on the ground. Boy is meant to be a boxer, and it shows through his signature arms, the Toaster, Boomerang, and Tribal. Movement-wise, he sets the standards for how quickly and how much everyone else can move, with his grab being able to do a total of 150 damage, the base arms girth at 100%, and having a sustained charge time of 2.6 seconds. Oh yeah, We haven't talked about charging yet, have we? You can temporarily enhance the damage output and your arm based on its attribute through charging. This can be done through touching the ground after jumping, shielding, or holding down the dash button through your dash until your character finishes charging. The length of time an arm remains charged depends on how long it's charged for, and every character charges for the same length of time. Shielding will only charge your arms to the base, default minimum charge amount, and is more to help you block and create an opening. Whereas if you hold the dash button after landing from a jump or through a dash, as the button is held, the character you're playing as will charge their arms longer, giving you more time to take your shot than if you had held it down for a shorter period of time or charged it through shielding. In addition, if you take too many hits and get knocked down while charged, you will lose your charge and have to do it again. You do want to be careful while charging though, as it leaves you very vulnerable. You can launch an attack, dash, jump, or shield if needed, but any of these actions will cancel your charge to where it has to start again. In Springman's case, this is actually a very valuable mechanic. Through charge canceling, one of Springman's signature abilities kicks in. By canceling a charge when your opponent's attack is about to hit, it allows you to deflect their offense and drop their arms to the ground, causing it to retract, allowing you an opportunity to parry it with your own counterattack, which is a really nice break from that rock, paper, scissors system I was talking about earlier. Springman has one more ability because he's just got that dog in him. Once your health has dropped down to 25%, his underdog mechanic kicks in. While you're below that health threshold, your arms stay permanently charged, even if knocked down. Next up, we've got Ribbon Girl, pop star extraordinaire and Taylor Swift of the arms world, with her signature arms, the Sparky, Popper, and Slapamander. Her stats overall look pretty similar to Springman, but she does have a shorter dash, a maximum charge time of 1.6 seconds, and a slightly smaller arm girth. Compared to Springman, she's a more mobile, airborne fighter. Her signature ability grants her far more air mobility than most of the other fighters, allowing her up to 4 mid-air jumps with gradually decaying jump heights as you perform them, 2 air dashes, and the ability to fast fall back to the stage when she's done in the sky. Overall, I would say her kit makes her far more aggressive when paired with smaller, faster arms, so she can be annoying in the same way that mosquitoes are really annoying, but because of this, she doesn't really get to make much use of her charge. Let's go ahead and talk about one of my personal favorites, Min Min. She has all the mobility of Springman, but again less arm girth and a shorter 1.6 second maximum charge time. Min Min has 2 signature abilities. Her first allows her to do a roundhouse kick out of charges and shield in order to deflect oncoming arms, although it is a little tricky to land. It's really great though when you need a solid opening to evade and charge up her second ability, the Dragon Arm. If Min Min can throw an opponent or get a full charge off, her left arm will bulk up and become permanently charged until thrown or knocked down. When this happens, it also increases the girth for her left arm as well, giving you a bigger chance to hit your opponent. This pairs up really well with her signature arms, the Dragon, Ram Ram, and Megawatt. Her ability to have a permanently charged arm at will, in addition to the ability to deflect anything with her defensive option, really rewarding an aggressive and oppressive playstyle. Lastly, for our initial 4, we have Olapop. She's slightly faster than most of the cast, and that's because she lends herself as being a highly mobile and defensive character. Her signature arms, the Funchuck, Biffler, and Clapback, allow her to play a more offensive game that focuses on using shielding to create an opening. Most characters can't really get away with this, but she can with her ability that allows her to balloon while shielding. This allows her to cancel out of her shield and jump into the air to dash, and if the dash button is held down, she'll fast fall right back onto the ground like a big bouncing ball. This allows her to retain her charge and her defensive without actually losing out on any of her mobility or other offensive options. I wanted to go over these 4 characters first because out of the 11 playable characters, there are a lot that are really tempting to start playing with right away. However, if you're brand new to the game or just really rusty like I was, I recommend starting with one of these 4 and going into the single player Grand Prix for a little bit to make sure that you have the basics down. The folks who are still playing ARMS online in 2024 are really good, so I don't want you to try it out and then get curb stomped. It's much better to get some basic experience in, get some badges that we'll talk about later, and then get curb stomped. Continuing down the list of characters, I'm going to start talking about them in the order I think they go in when it comes to being the most beginner friendly to the most technical and hardest to master. Up next, we've got Master Mummy, our first really beefy boy. This guy is a monster and he looks the part too. He's slow, he's tanky because he's our first character with super armor, so he can't be knocked down or flinches easily, with only a few attributes being able to penetrate that super armor. Those being fire, wind, electricity, and ice. And every time he throws you, he's going to be doing 200 damage. That is a whole fifth of your health pool. His maximum charge time is 2.8 seconds, though he's not bad at not just being a wall, but also making sure that that wall is going to mess up your day. Oh, and by the way, do you remember when I said that every character has the same amount of health? Well, I lied. Because of his super armor, anytime he resists a punch, he takes half the normal amount of damage, so functionally, his health pool can be at most 2000 HP. This pairs really well with his signature ability, which heals him in 10 health increments while shielded, and these health increments speed up the longer he's shielded. This sounds really great in theory, and while it could possibly help stall out the timer in close health situations, realistically I feel it's one of the weaker abilities in the game and not really worth using, especially when you've got fast bruisers like Ninjara coming in. Ninjara is obviously a ninja. And that comes with ninja speed and reflexes. Like, look at the speed on this guy. He's by far one of the fastest and most agile characters in the game, and his signature arms, the Chakram, Buff, and Tri-Blast, mean that he's effectively ready to take most things you throw at him, because you probably aren't going to outmaneuver him. This is mostly thanks to his signature ability, which allows him to vanish whenever he successfully air dodges or blocks an attack. It really helps against Ninjara to brush up on your reading skills and to have time on your side like Twintel. For the most part, she's a fairly standard fighter, but with a grab damage of a 160. Honestly, there's not much to talk about here aside from her signature ability, which allows her to slow time down around her while charging or air dashing. Outside of that, the other thing that's interesting about Twintel is that her arms are actually her hair. One other big mechanic is that you can disable your opponent's arms by hitting them head on while they're retracted. Because her arms are higher up on her body than normal, they're much more difficult to actually disable. But other than that, that's it. That's the tweet. Mechanica is basically Master Mummy, but if she were slightly faster, had the same super armor capabilities, is cute, and she can float instead of heal. While dashing, you can extend the length of the dash, allowing you to glide around the floor of the arena while maintaining your charge status. She's meant to be a really mobile land fighter that should always be in motion and sustaining a charge. But keep in mind, while her super armor does give her functionally more health, while she's floating, she does become more susceptible to things like fire or being frozen, as she's not going to get knocked down like other characters whenever they're in the air. Speaking of, that brings us to Springtron. As his name and appearance may suggest, he's a clone of Springman, but with a couple of key differences. For starters, he's slower and less mobile, with a slightly shorter jump and dash length. He also has the longest full charge for any other character we've talked about so far, clocking in at 9.25 seconds. Similar to Springman, Springtron can also avoid taking damage by deflecting attacks, but this time with perfect timing on a jump or dash. In addition, if he manages to get fully charged, he creates a large shockwave that not only completely disables your opponent's active arms for a couple of seconds, but also buffs his speed and aerial movement so he can move faster and air dash further. To trade off for these benefits, he lacks Springman's permanent charge at 25% or less health, instead receiving an overall decrease in his aerial movement speed. Springtron is kind of like a guy that you just want to hit hard and fast with. Bite and Bark. I actually don't think that these guys are that technical or difficult to play. I just don't think that they're that good. With this duo, you control Bite, and Bark does his own thing, since he's a dog. You can use Bark as a jump pad to get some height, which actually allows you to parry attacks like Springman when landing on Bark, and Bark will also launch his own arm at enemies. But in order to make use of either of these two things, you really have to pay more attention to what Bark is doing, and making sure that you're in position to do something with him. So I just don't see that these guys are as really viable in competitive play. They do get a bit of a speed buff while in rush mode though, which can be valuable to reset the map and your overall positioning. Overall, I feel like there's just too much risk with the tools that make them interesting to be worthwhile, but I would be really excited to be wrong. That's all to contrast against the all-time GOAT and Commissioner of the Arms League, Max Brass. This guy is basically Springman, but better in every possible way. Sure, he's a little bit slower, but he more than makes up with it with his increased arm girth and throw damage at 170 a pop. In addition, his kit of abilities is really similar to Springman's in the sense that if you can get a throw or full charge off, his signature ability activates. In addition to parrying arms, Max Brass goes on an absolute warpath, gaining super armor and taking 50% less damage, which is really easy to activate and make use of, as it will be active for the entire 5.1 second charge sustain time. Once he's below 25%, you know the drill. He's now permabuffed, giving him super armor and permanently charged arms for the rest of the round. That sounds ridiculously strong, and that's because it is. But good Max Brass rounds are some of my favorites to watch because they're just so hype. Almost as hype as a good Helix player. He's just kind of a weird guy, you know, not because he's a blob of goo.
But who would want goo?
You want goo!
But because I don't feel like his signature arms, the Blorb, Ice Dragon, and Guardian, actually support his playstyle and kit. These are all really weird choices, in my opinion, to run as default, mostly just because Helix's kit revolves around the fact that he's a blob of goo. Hold jump, and he's now a difficult to hit but offensive goo tower that can't move but can dodge in any direction. And if you hold dash, he's now a difficult to hit blob of goo that can run around the floor. And while he's in either mode, his charge is sustained indefinitely until he switches out of it. Helix kind of goes for this kind of slippery, all over the place way to play to confuse your opponent to create an opening, but the default arms aren't really great at supporting that. I recommend if you play Helix, wait until you unlock some arms for him before you really dig into it. With that, we're down to the last 3 characters in the game, and I think in general these are the 3 most technical in the game: Kid Cobra, Misongo, and Dr. Coil. A lot of more seasoned players may take a look at this list and say, Cobra, bruh, Helix though. And to that, I would say that you're wrong, and probably not subscribed to the channel. Did you know that 99% of you aren't? So if you've made it this far, please make sure to subscribe. It's free, and it'll really help on my mission to grassroots arms and preach the good word of Yabuki-san, as well as enable me to make more high-quality informational content like this video. Even if arms isn't your game is probably next. Anyway, I've got to focus. We got to get through these characters. So the main reason that Kid Cobra made the list higher than Helix is because I didn't really understand him at all until I was actually making this video. You see, he's the slowest of the cast when it comes to dashing, but he has a higher than normal walk speed and a crazy high jump, all while having the largest arm girth in the game as a medium weight character. That just feels weird, right? But then, that's when I looked at his default arms and remembered, bro's a snake. His default arms, the Slamamander, Tribolt, and Coolerang, really lend their hands well to his slithering playstyle, further enabled by his ability. Another couple of arms that really elevate Cobra are the Clapback and Popper. This setup is really ridiculous as it lets you cover a ton of space with attacks in a short time because as he charges, he gains up to 5 quick dashes that he can fire off in rapid succession, giving him by far the most land mobility out of any character. He's a character that really is played best by fighting indirectly, getting around your opponent, and landing multiple curved hits, especially for similarly mobile characters like Dr. Coil. If I said that Cobra is the most mobile lane character, Coil is the most mobile character, period. Imagine this. You're playing arms and your opponent is Mechanica, but she's flying all matched, and she can also adjust her height by holding down jump. And sometimes she has a third arm that randomly chooses between her right and left side, so you never know where it's coming from, and that third arm does full damage if it's the only one that connects, or slightly reduced damage if both punches from that side connects. Also, she can turn invisible at will by shielding or getting knocked down. At least she doesn't have super armor, right? Really, that's Coil in a nutshell. Slap any arm on her, you'll be fine and have fun. She's really simple to play, but really technical to actually get good with because of how many different playstyles she can cater to. Our last fighter is Misongo. He's easily the most technical character in the game, and I don't know that anyone's fully figured out how to actually play him, as he doesn't make very many tournament appearances. What makes him a really interesting fighter isn't so much him himself, as much as it is his little spirit friend. This little guy will change colors every second and a half, between blue, red, and yellow in that order. If Misongo guards long enough, the spirit will assume a totem form and drop down in front of him, effectively creating a barrier to fend off attacks. What's really interesting though is that Misongo can walk into this totem or fully charge even if the totem isn't up and put on the spirit friend as a mask, correlating to the color it currently is. The yellow mask causes the rush gauge to fill faster, but decreases your movement speed and grab damage to 150. The red mask grants Misongo super armor, reducing damage by 50% and making him less likely to flinch or get knocked down. Increases your grab damage to 180 and increases the size and girth of your arms at the cost of losing your land and air mobility. The blue mask makes him faster in both land and in the air, decreases arm girth and grab damage to 150 again, and grants the ability to super dash after jumping by holding down the dash button at the moment he lands. On top of that, he can take off or put on a mask at any time as long as he fully charges or shields for long enough that the mask will change into a totem. And that's it for all the characters and what you need to know about them to jump in. And people say that ARMS has no depth. Hard to believe we've spent that much time and we haven't even gotten to advanced tech yet. We're actually not going to be covering advanced tech like restanding, buffer jumping, arm canceling, or other things like retraction management in this video because this is the beginner's guide. If you'd like to dig into that, I recommend visiting the ARMS Institute. It's an independent fan-made wiki that details all of the advanced tech I just mentioned and more. I just wanted to mention that and get that out of the way before we actually talk about ARMS. Okay, so I know that we've been talking about ARMS, the video game, but I mean like ARMS, the weapons. That's what they're called. I don't have a better name for it. I wanted to make this section much shorter in comparison and way more digestible because there's a lot of ARMS, but they can get pretty well boiled down into a few categories. It took a while, but I settled on the following 5 groups. Jabs are essentially your straight shots, comprised of gloves, megas, umbrellas, the scully, and hammers. These will all generally move straight, with some varying degree that you can curve them, but not as much as other arms. Those 5 subcategories all have their own categories when it comes to how straight they go, so I would just play with them to find out. Hooks are your curve shots, namely your chakrams and boomerangs. Blocks are essentially mobile shields, and there are really only 2. The clapback and guardian. Mix-ups are arms that change how they launch depending on if you're in the ground or in the air, or they just don't fit into any other single category. These include things like nunchucks, the Scorpio, blobs, and torpedoes. Lastly, projectiles are arms that shoot off from you initially, but end up firing their own projectiles that are harder to knock down than a standard arm. These are things like bolts, revolvers, dragons, the bifflers, poppers, the lockjaw, and the birds. Generally, I'm going to recommend that out of the 3 arms you get to choose in a match, that you set yourself up with a jab, a hook, and then your choice of a projectile, block, or mix-up, depending on your main and playstyle. That's really where you get to experiment a little bit. The big thing to keep in mind when experimenting though is that each of these categories get further split up by the following attributes. Fire knocks down your opponent and deals an additional 30 damage in most cases. Electric stuns your opponent and practically makes him completely immobile for 1.25 seconds for most electric arms, or 1.75 seconds for the Seiki and Guardian, allowing you to knock them down or go for a safe grab. Wind blows your opponents away, knocking them down and dealing an additional 10 damage. Ice freezes your opponent and disables their ability to jump or dash, as well as slowing down their attack speed while also dealing an additional 10 damage. Stun, which really just stuns your opponent for a couple of seconds so you can get another quick hit in. I personally don't really find this one super useful. Blind is essentially the blooper from Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. They cover your opponent's screen with either goo or fun stamps of Biff, depending on which one you use. Poison gradually chips away at your opponent's health every second, starting small at 1 damage every half second, but as you hit your opponent with more poison, it refreshes the duration and increases the poison chips up to 3 total damage every half second, all while causing them to stutter and slow their movement. And lastly, we have explosives. Enough said. You do want to be careful with these though, because they're great for exploding your opponents, but your opponents can also explode you. As a quick little side note, there are actually 4 arms that don't have any kind of attribute at all, those being the Megaton, Bub, Buff, and Clapback. I wouldn't recommend using these as often as they're generally just going to be similar arms but with some other attribute. It would be really situational like the Clapback if you chose to use them. That said, you also want to make sure that you aren't actually overlapping attributes with your 3 arms chosen for your character either. Why have 3 fire arms when you can have a fire, a wind, and a poison? Or whatever other attribute you prefer. When selecting your arms, one other thing should be taken into consideration. Some arms are bigger and heavier than others. These arms will move slower, but also give an additional 10 damage when using 2 megatons. These arms also go through smaller arms, so they're a really great way to block a grab or block other hits while still getting some offense in. With all this talk about the different kinds of arms, one thing is really apparent when you start the game though, and then that's that you don't really have any. You need to unlock them for each fighter, so how do you do that? And do it quickly? The answer to that is with the Arms Getter. This is kind of like a single player loot box where you exchange tokens you earn in-game for rounds in the Arm Getter. More tokens equals more time per round equals more arms. You can get tokens through winning matches, or you could do the smart thing and play the Grand Prix like I told you to, in order to rack up badges, which award tokens fast. When you get into the Arms Getter, the character you choose will have priority, but you will get an assortment of arms you haven't unlocked for the entire cast. Also, you want to make sure that you're unlocking every arm twice. After you get an arm the first time, you can still get it again to upgrade it to a plus arm. It's not mandatory because it only deals an additional 10 damage, but every little bit helps, huh? And there you have it. You're now a professional new arms player, ready to usher in the new golden age of arms. So I want to end this video with the age-old question. If nobody but the BrettWils YouTube comment section is talking about arms, where can you actually play? Of course, Party Match is still alive and kicking, and you'll have no issues finding random opponents. But of course, if you're like me and want to get involved in the community, I'll be leaving 3 links in the video description. These are Discord links to the current main hubs of the ARMS community: ARMS Central, Neo Party Crash, and SNG Cord. This is where players come together to play friendlies, have tournaments, and chat about the game. Of course, I'll also be leaving a link to my own Discord if you're not that into the competitive side of ARMS, but you do want to join in the discussion within our little community. In addition, I'll also be leaving that link to the ARMS Institute, that independent community-owned wiki that I was talking about earlier. It was an incredibly important tool that I used to put this video together. Without that and guidance from SNG Arms and a professional player by the name of Prince, this video would not have been as full of information as it is. Both of them are definitely worth a follow. Anyway, I just want to thank you so much for checking out this video. If you are a new player and you've been really interested in the game from the couple of videos that I've made, or a returning but rusty player trying to get into the ring, I hope that you found this as a valuable resource to get you started, because I definitely learned a few new things myself in the process of making it. I hope to be able to make more videos like this one for other games that I'd like people to get into as well as some more polished video essays on my thoughts of the gaming industry that I don't see explained and answered too often. So make sure you leave a like and subscribe if that's something that interests you. Until next time, I'll be seeing you in the ring.